the stories. Paramedic who kept one final snapshot. The story began with a photo that shouldn't have existed. A single Polaroid, slightly overexposed, showing the inside of an ambulance during a call that supposedly never happened. It was discovered years later, tucked between the pages of an old medical manual in a small-town fire station's archive. The man behind that photo was Martin Kessler, a 42-year-old paramedic who'd spent nearly 2 decades working in a quiet coastal county. He was the kind of person people trusted instantly, steady hands, calm voice, always first on scene and last to leave. Colleagues said he never forgot a face, even from calls years earlier. That photographic memory made the irony of what happened next impossible to ignore. In late March of 2012, Martin and his partner, Dana Ruiz, responded to a dispatch from a stretch of highway north of town. A rollover accident, single vehicle, one driver, reportedly conscious but trapped. The log shows they arrived at 2:17 a.m. Weather clear, visibility decent. Everything about the report was ordinary. Until it wasn't. When firefighters reached the car, there was no one inside. Seatbelt unbuckled, airbags deployed, engine still ticking from heat, no footprints in the gravel shoulder, no sign of struggle. Dana's field notes mention Martin standing there longer than anyone, staring into the dark beyond the guardrail, as if waiting for something to move. He didn't say much on the drive back, just, "It doesn't feel right. Someone was here." The next morning, Martin called the dispatcher, asking for the driver's name. There wasn't one. The system had registered the call as civilian report unknown source. No, 911 record existed, only a radio relay from a patrol unit that later denied making it. That was when Martin started keeping a notebook part medical log, part journal. He filled it with incident details that didn't make sense, addresses that didn't appear on maps, names that changed between shift reports, an emergency call from a decommissioned nursing home that had burned down 5 years earlier. Dana joked it was his ghost file, but Martin treated it like evidence. In mid-April, station archives show him requesting a portable camera from inventory, the kind still used for accident documentation. He said he wanted backups for reports. No one questioned it. That camera became the source of the one photo that remains. On May 5th, Martin responded alone to a cardiac distress call in a residential neighborhood. The official dispatch recorded a woman named Eleanor Marsh, age 71. When Dana arrived 15 minutes later, the house was empty. No patient, no signs of struggle, only Martin sitting on the front steps, shaking. He told her he'd just finished chest compressions, but there was no body. That evening, he turned in a sealed envelope to the station chief. Inside, a single Polaroid showing an elderly woman on a stretcher inside the ambulance. Her face pale but peaceful, IV line in her arm, heart monitor reading a steady rhythm. The timestamp on the photo matched the call, yet no hospital in the region logged a patient by that name, and the ambulance's GPS data placed it in the station lot at the time. For weeks, the department treated it as a data glitch, a wrong timestamp, maybe a mistaken upload. Martin, however, stopped taking calls entirely. He used his accumulated leave and disappeared from the rotation. Dana later said he'd started visiting the county records office, spending hours looking through missing persons reports from the 1990s onward. According to the clerk's statement, he requested files on one case repeatedly, a local woman, 71 years old, who'd vanished from her home in May of 1996. Her name, Eleanor Marsh. She'd been last seen the same week a younger Martin had begun his EMT training in that same county. What tied them together came from an old photograph Martin found in the file. It showed a group of EMT trainees standing beside a vintage ambulance. On the far left, a younger Martin smiling awkwardly. On the far right, a woman in a white nurse's uniform, Eleanor, back when she'd volunteered with the training program. Her sudden disappearance had never been solved. The case quietly closed after 3 years. The evidence stacking grew stranger. In late May, an internal audit found Martin had accessed archived radio frequencies from the old dispatch system equipment retired in 1999. He'd been trying to trace the source of that first mysterious accident call. Logs showed someone or something still transmitting on that outdated frequency once every few nights, always repeating the same brief phrase, medic en route. By early June, Martin returned to work briefly, though he looked exhausted, his once steady hands trembling. He told Dana he thought the woman from the Polaroid had been trying to reach him for years, that all the phantom calls were echoes of old emergencies, looping through time until someone finally answered. She begged him to take time off again, but he refused. "If I stop listening," he said, "they'll stop trying to come home." The last confirmed sighting of Martin Kessler was on June 15th of that year. Surveillance footage from a rural gas station shows him fueling the ambulance alone, headlights off, before driving north toward the old highway. The timestamp reads 2:17 a.m., the exact minute of the original rollover call. 3 days later, the ambulance was found parked beside a defunct rest stop, keys still in the ignition. The driver's side door was open, the radio turned to static. In the back compartment, responders discovered a single Polaroid camera lying on the gurney. It contained one undeveloped sheet of film. That image was later processed by the state lab. It showed the inside of the ambulance, empty except for a stretcher, with two folded paramedic jackets placed neatly side by side. The back doors stood open, facing a foggy stretch of road. The official report labeled Martin Kessler missing, presumed deceased. No further transmissions were logged from the old frequency. The firehouse quietly retired his call sign, and the Polaroid was sealed in evidence storage, tagged simply, "Recovered from Unit 7, June 15, 2012. Years later, when new recruits asked about him, veterans would point to the framed photo on the wall, the one of Martin and Dana receiving their service award in 2010. Behind the glass, barely visible under the reflection of overhead lights, there's a faint double exposure. The outline of an ambulance interior, doors open, a stretcher waiting. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. The snapshot was real, the patient never existed, and somewhere along that forgotten highway, a paramedic might have finally answered a call meant only for him. The stories. Why this motel room safe changed everything. They called it a budget motel along a long highway spur, where road dust gathered in corners and secrets settled quietly. The room safe in number 12 looked ordinary enough, powder-coated steel with a keypad that beeped politely at tired travelers. Lyle Garza woke before sunrise on a Tuesday, 38 years old, and working claims for a regional insurer. He had driven 3 hours to meet a policyholder whose pickup had burned behind the old diner, and he wanted clean paperwork today. He checked into the motel first, showered fast, then laid out forms on the dresser, careful about matching VIN digits and timestamps. His plan was simple: wrap the inspection before lunch, then circle back for photos and voice notes after the truck release. He liked driving while the day still felt open, and he told himself the assignment would be routine and forgettable. It had been forgettable until the manager knocked. 2 quick raps, then a pause heavy enough to make him frown. Mara Quintero stood in the doorway with a clipboard, 34, managing rooms and payroll while raising her nephew after school. She asked if he had heard the beeps from the safe, because front desk saw brief power spikes last night. Lyle said he had not used the safe, and she nodded, eyes moving toward the keypad like someone checking a stove twice. Maintenance had logged an odd complaint the previous afternoon. Reportedly, a guest in 12 claimed the safe ate his wallet. The man left before checkout, promising to call the card companies, and a note in the margin said possible intoxication. Mara said housekeeping later pulled the bedding and found a small metal tool near the baseboard. Lyle picked up the tool carefully with a tissue, a thin square of steel with a notch like a feeler gauge. He set it on the desk with his forms, then opened his voice recorder, speaking in that steady tone he used for field notes. He described the room, the safe brand, the tool, and the time on the microwave clock because simple details held steady on lonely days. Mara asked if he knew how to clear the safe code since the master sheet had gone missing during renovations last winter. He did not, but he knew the trick of powering off consumer locks, which could flip hidden defaults, according to a warehouse supervisor he once interviewed. He unplugged the mini fridge, found the breaker panel behind a painting, then asked permission to shut the room briefly. They stood in the doorway while the lights flickered, and the highway hummed like a restless air conditioner beyond the lot. He waited 10 seconds, restored power, then tapped the keypad with a ballpoint, feeling silly and a little curious. The safe beeped twice in a lower tone, which he recognized from a training video about apartment lockouts, reportedly used by traveling warranty teams. He tried a factory code that someone had once mumbled during a fire inspection, and the safe chirped, green light winking. The door opened an inch against a sticky seal, and Mara let out a nervous laugh, surprised and worried in equal measure. Inside sat a clear zipper pouch with a folded receipt, a motel keycard from another town, and a small black voice recorder. He found a driver loyalty card attached to the receipt, and he read the printed name softly without repeating it twice. The dates lined up with last week in neat columns, and the purchase list looked like roadside dinners between midnight and 2. He asked Mara if the guest from yesterday had paid cash, and she nodded, then reached for the phone to check archived calls. The front desk handset kept scratchy tapes by default, a habit from the previous owner who never trusted software invoices. She played a call stamped at 2 in the morning, where a tired voice asked for room 12, mentioning a late delivery, and stiff back. Another call at 2:30 asked about vending, and a third at 4 asked if nobody would bother him until noon. Lyle switched to evidence mode, careful and methodical, letting his coffee cool while he cataloged the pouch contents. He photographed the safe before moving anything, then called his supervisor to report an unexpected discovery unrelated to the truck claim. The supervisor told him to act reasonably and preserve anything with identifiable information, then to keep his focus on the scheduled inspection. He listened to the voice recorder after asking Mara to stay within earshot, since 2 listeners felt wiser than one on strange mornings. The first file held roadway noise, then a quiet tone of someone rehearsing directions, same room number repeated like a sticky thought. The second file was shorter, a man saying he could not keep doing this and that she would understand once it was delivered safely. He paused to note the words safely, which felt pointed given the open door and the blinking keypad. He bagged the recorder in a zip bag from his kit, then checked the keycard from the other town, which was stamped with a lion logo. Mara recognized the chain and said there was a property 30 miles north, mostly used by truckers and medical travelers. He returned the room to normal and headed for the burned truck with his camera bag, but his plan had started to wobble. The pickup sat behind a towing yard fence, soot clinging thick to the firewall, while melted wires drooped like tired ivy. He worked the usual grid of photos, then the odometer and the cargo bed, then cross-reference with dispatch notes he had requested by email. The fire report smelled like common engine loss, not sabotage, and he felt relief settle along his shoulders as the cause narrowed. He dictated measurements and closed the laptop, then looked at his watch and thought about the safe again and the trembling voice. He felt a nudge of duty that had nothing to do with premiums, and he drove back to the motel through heat that made the road shimmer. Mara met him with a printout of last night guests, which listed an alias that matched the loyalty card name partly. The address field showed a mail drop location, familiar to freight drivers who rolled through without a fixed base. She said a long white tractor had idled near the ice machine last night, according to a neighbor who called about fumes after midnight. He asked for the neighbor number, then listened to a careful woman describe a man in a reflective jacket with a limp. She said he stayed near room 12 door, not inside, as if waiting for someone to arrive quietly or leave quickly. She heard 2 quiet knocks around 3, and a soft voice answered, then a cart rattle like someone moving luggage without wheels. Lyle opened the pouch again and noticed a handwritten code on the receipt back, 4 digits and a messy star next to it. He tried the code on the safe, and the delay light flashed, which often meant an old user lockout or a wrong sequence. He snapped a photo and lowered the door, then rolled the notched tool between his fingers, a weight that felt borrowed from someone patient. He thought about a repairman he had interviewed in 2019 who taught him that thieves love patterns more than courage. The man said patterns live in receipts, tolls, and vending logs, because tired people seek familiar sandwiches and coffee brands. Lyle searched the loyalty program website on his phone, typed the partial name and 4 digits, and got a generic profile with travel points. The profile showed recent redemptions listed by city, and he wrote them on a notepad, then drew lines between dates and approximate routes. The cities formed a loop around distribution centers, with brief pauses near hospitals and bulk pharmacy hubs, according to public maps. He felt his heart step faster as the voice recorder line about delivered safely nudged his thoughts toward the quiet side of medicine. He told Mara he would drive north to the Lion Logo Motel for a quick visit, and she insisted on calling ahead politely. The clerk up there skimmed her stay sheets and mentioned a forgotten envelope last week found under a mattress frame during turnover. The envelope held nothing when housekeeping retrieved it, but a corner showed marks from a rubber band, reportedly stretched tight. He reached the northern property by mid-afternoon, watched trucks rock gently in wind, and asked for the manager on duty. A tall man with tired eyes met him in the lobby, said a nurse had asked about a lost pouch 3 nights ago. She wore a badge from a staffing agency, spoke quickly, and left a number that went to voicemail full by morning. The manager allowed a quick look at the lost and found cabinet, which contained phone chargers, a chipped mug, 3 lanyards, and a plastic bag with an empty pharmacy sticker peeled halfway. Lyle photographed the bag and wrote the former label number carefully, then stepped into the parking lot to call a friend in compliance he trusted. The friend checked a public database of recalls and shortages, then told him to consider the rise in small clinical thefts along transport corridors. He returned to his car and replayed the second audio file, hearing the way the man swallowed hard between sentences. The phrase "delivered safely" stuck again, and he wondered if safely meant to someone specific, not to a warehouse or anonymous shelf. He drove back to the first motel with a plan forming, not quite a theory, but a set of steps that could either untangle or embarrass him. He asked Mara for permission to review last week's camera footage that covered the breezeway near room 12, and she agreed. The feed was old, grainy, and stamped with the wrong date, since nobody reset it after storms in 2015. Still, silhouettes moved clearly enough. And at 3:12, a figure in a reflective jacket appeared with a short, careful stride. The figure waited near the door, then crouched to slide something under, then stood fast as another figure approached from the stairwell. The second person carried a rolling cart with a blanket thrown over, which hung low enough to hide a small, cooler shape. They exchanged a short handshake, then rolled the cart toward the soda machine area, where cameras always blinked with static. Lyle paused the frame and sketched the handshake position, because small, consistent gestures tied people to habits when faces stayed hidden. He compared the notebook times to the archived calls, matching the neighbor report with the footage minute stamp nearly exactly. He folded his notes and looked at Mara, who watched quietly with the clipboard held like a shield against a sudden chill. He called the non-emergency line and asked to speak with property crimes, then explained he was an adjuster who found items in a room safe. He said the items might connect to an ongoing pattern, not a single incident, and that he was available to hand them over cleanly. The dispatcher thanked him and routed the call, and he kept his voice steady while explaining that nobody was hurt today. The detective who arrived wore a tie gone soft at the edges, a man who had seen this exact motel a dozen times. He took the pouch, the recorder, and copies of the photos, then asked Lyle to explain the breaker trick and the code attempts. He nodded at the handshake frame and said a group had moved product along back roads for months, staying under dollar thresholds on purpose. Lyle asked quietly if product meant medicine, and the detective said people cut solutions with water and resold to small clinics. In some stories, the clinics were victims with forged orders, and in others, they were partners, trying to stretch short supplies like taffy. The man in the reflector jacket likely ran deliveries for cash while hauling legal freight, which made tracing routes messy and confusing. The detective listened to the voice files twice, then looked at the loyalty redemptions and circled 2 cities with his pen. He said the phrase "delivered safely" could mean to a person at a care home who could not pay official prices anymore. The pouch might have served as a drop signal, and the room safe might have held a stopgap in case someone panicked. They took statements from Mara and the neighbor by phone, and the manager at the northern property sent a scanned copy of his notes. The detective collected the notch tool and said it was standard for bypassing cam locks, which matched a series of quiet thefts from vending. He asked Lyle to write a formal summary of his steps, meticulous and dated, and to expect a follow-up if a warrant landed later. Lyle finished the paper part in his room, breathing slow while light crept through the blinds in a warm, tired stripe. He wrote down the way the safe beeped twice after power restoration, which suggested a default that any one patient could eventually find. He wrote the route loop and the hospital adjacency, and he wrote the voice phrasing exactly because transcription mattered when memories warped. He closed his laptop and stared at the open safe like it wanted to be ordinary again, silent and blank and light. He felt that shift people talk about when routine work bends into something it has no business touching on a weekday. He thought about honest clinics, rationing doses, then about someone paying cash at 3 in the morning because a parent cried. At dusk, the detective called back and said a unit found the white tractor idling near a different budget property downtown. The driver had the same chain lanyard from the lost and found cabinet, and his phone contained notes about room safes by brand. He reportedly told officers he was only a messenger and that someone else handled actual swapping and dilution, which sounded flat and practiced. Lyle listened quietly and said he would be available if a deposition request arrived. Then he sat with the keycard on the dresser. He knew he would remember the feel of that notched tool because it had a purpose-built patience that felt personal. He knew he would remember the cheap beep of the safe and the way a single small space changed the line of his day. A week later, he got an email from the detective, brief and measured, thanking him for the timeline and the careful photos. The message said the pouch had traces of saline and a label adhesive compound common to medical packaging of a certain class. The voice on the recorder matched a man pulled over near a way station, according to dispatch logs and an archived booking photo. Lyle drove back to the motel after closing another case, and he asked Mara how business felt since the long Tuesday. She said people still stopped for highway rest, and she tightened a few procedures quietly, preferring to let small changes speak. She now kept master codes in a locked drawer and replaced 3 aging safes with models that logged attempts for a full week. They stood in room 12 a moment, like visitors paying respects to an inanimate witness that never blinked. The safe sat closed and calm, doing exactly what a box was meant to do, which felt both reassuring and strange. He signed the receipt for his stay, then shook her hand, and promised to bring better stories next time through. On the drive home, he thought about the phrase delivered safely again and how words can hide more than they reveal. He wondered how many small transactions keep the world running, good and bad, unremarkable and decisive, stacked behind quiet doors. He decided the safe had not made him heroic or special, it had only reminded him that dull edges can cut when pressure builds. He kept working claims, taking pictures of bent bumpers and damp carpet, writing notes with careful times and plain language. He still believed that truth likes details, and that details prefer patient notebooks, not flashy speeches or clever hunches. When he thought about that Tuesday, he did not think about danger or chase lights. He thought about how a box opened and a day veered left. Mara hired another housekeeper and bought a better cart, one that glided without rattling near cameras and soda machines. She laughed more at the front desk now, but her eyes still checked keys and codes before she turned off the lights. She told her nephew that small routines matter, like counting towels and returning clipboards, because order resists the creep of careless luck. The detective moved on to other cases and sent one last note months later, carefully worded, acknowledging ongoing court schedules. He wrote that the room safe discovery had clarified timing between suspects, which helped align witness statements with fuel receipts precisely. He added a line about public hearings scheduled for late next spring, where facts would hopefully land on paper clearly. The motel kept renting room 12 to travelers who wanted ground-level convenience and an easy walk to the ice. The safe held wallets and passports and nothing dramatic for a while, which suited everyone whose name stayed off any report. The highway kept pouring itself past the parking lot, and the night clerk kept coffee hot for anyone who needed comfort. Lyle sometimes thought about stopping by without a claim, just to buy a soda and wave at the office through dusty glass. He pictured the safe blinking quietly in that square of afternoon sun, as if practicing for whatever day came next. He accepted that the box had not changed him completely, but it had polished a habit he already valued deeply. He looked back on it like a narrow bridge he crossed safely, not a legend, just a real span over a quiet creek. He had listened, he had written, he had looked twice, and he had taken small steps that lined up neatly. That felt like enough for a life that preferred steady roads to loud headlines. and it still does. The stories. Night guard who logged footsteps, no camera recorded. The night it happened, the security office at the old Westmore shipping depot smelled like dust and burnt coffee. According to shift logs, a 42-year-old guard named Dennis Halbrook clocked in at 11:30 p.m. and wrote a short note. Asterisk. Routine patrol. Clear floor. Humid tonight. Asterisk. He was the only guard on duty. By dawn, his chair was empty, his flashlight was lying under the main stairwell, and the building's cameras, 8 of them, showed nothing from the hours between midnight and 2. Westmore had been a Rust Belt landmark since the late 1970s, a concrete maze of loading bays and silent conveyor belts on the edge of a quiet Midwestern town. Dennis had worked there for 7 years, divorced, reliable, usually quiet. The kind of man who showed up early and read old paperbacks during breaks. That night was supposed to be uneventful, just a standard walkthrough before the building was scheduled for renovation. Around 12:10, he logged a line in the duty notebook kept beside the monitor screens. Asterisk. Footsteps on mezzanine catwalk, West Wing. Checked cams, no feed, asterisk. A minute later, asterisk. Still hearing it, will inspect, asterisk. That was the last thing he ever wrote. The plant's internal system backed up video every 6 hours. When investigators reviewed the footage from the mezzanine camera, the feed cut to static precisely at 12:08. Other cameras kept recording fine until 2:30, showing only flickering lights and empty halls. A maintenance worker named Harold Cortez arrived early that morning to replace fluorescent tubes on the ground level. He found Dennis's flashlight lying on its side, beam still weakly glowing, and the notebook open. No sign of struggle, no torn fabric, no blood. Just footprints, 2 sets tracked faintly through the dust. One set from Dennis's standard issue boots, the other, smaller, bare, leading to the freight elevator that hadn't worked in months. The county sheriff's department filed the case as a missing person. Official notes cited malfunctioning surveillance and probable equipment interference. But people who'd worked there doubted the malfunction explanation. Westmore's night tech, a woman named Carla Wynn, swore she'd serviced those cameras the previous week. They were old, but fine, she told local reporters. The cables were intact. You can't lose a feed that clean unless someone cuts power at the board. Dennis's sister, a nurse named Ruth, said he'd called her the night before. He'd sounded distracted, mentioning he'd found a second badge lying by the locker room door. She assumed he meant another guard's ID, but the company only issued one active credential, his. Archived building logs later showed the same badge used twice that night, once when Dennis clocked in, again at 12:11, opening the West Wing stairwell door. Whoever used it the second time moved toward the mezzanine exactly where Dennis had gone to investigate. By late summer of 2014, the company shut down the depot and cleared out the interior. Cleanup crews unearthed a small personal cassette recorder near a ventilation shaft behind the third bay. It contained about 30 seconds of audio, the hum of lights, a pair of quick footsteps, a metallic clank, then Dennis's voice saying, "Who's up there?" followed by a short distortion burst and silence. Audio engineers confirmed the tape had been magnetically warped, likely by exposure to a strong field, not heat or age. There was another strange detail buried in the sheriff's supplementary report, a mention of radio interference in patrol channels between 12 and 12:30. The on-call dispatcher logged fragments of words bleeding through static asterisk. Northgate, lights out, he's still here. Asterisk, none of the other guards were on duty that night, and the next scheduled patrol wasn't until morning. Years later, a local journalist named Owen Ralston revisited the case for a regional history program. He interviewed former employees and found that in 1998, 2 decades earlier, another guard, 39-year-old Gerald Pike, had disappeared during overnight maintenance. Same mezzanine, same missing camera footage, same unexplained power surge. Back then, the report blamed faulty wiring. Ralston tracked down Gerald's surviving son, who showed him an old Polaroid his father had taken before the disappearance. The photo captured the West Wing catwalk at night, lights flickering in the distance. In the lower right corner, partially blurred, was a faint silhouette that seemed to be looking down at whoever held the camera. Analysts couldn't verify whether it was a reflection or a person. But when the journalist compared the layout of that image with modern floor plans, he noticed something: the angle matched exactly where Dennis's flashlight was later found. What made it worse, the timestamp written in blue ink on the Polaroid's border, asterisk, the 3rd of April 1998, 12:11 a. M asterisk was identical to the digital record of Dennis's badge swipe, asterisk 12:11 a. M asterisk, two men, 16 years apart, logged in the same minute of the hour, in the same corridor, just before both vanished. Electrical engineers consulted during Ralston's project suggested a pattern of ground faults that might have caused rolling blackouts localized to one wing, possibly scrambling old analog video circuits. It could explain the synchronized failures, but they couldn't explain how both guards' ID logs and physical traces pointed to motion beyond any camera's field. In late autumn of 2021, the depot site was finally demolished. Before the demolition, a volunteer archivist named Leah Torres cataloged remaining items from the security office for the county museum. Inside a rusted filing cabinet, she found the original duty notebook sealed in a plastic evidence bag. Most pages were smudged, but the last line stood clear under the dried ink. Asterisk. Still hearing it. Will inspect. Asterisk. Beneath it, barely visible under a tilt of light, another faint line appeared, impressed by pen pressure, not ink. Forensic enhancement later revealed, asterisk, recording this time. Asterisk. That phrase matched an unfiled cassette found near Dennis's locker years earlier, the same type used for the warped tape. The archivist played it carefully on a restored deck. The audio was faint, but at the 13-second mark came what experts described as a pattern of steps, counted 7, then stop. The acoustics placed it roughly 10 feet above the ground, consistent with the mezzanine. When news of the find resurfaced, Ralston added an epilogue to his documentary. He pointed out that both the 1998 and 2014 incidents shared one quiet constant. The security logs always mentioned footsteps, but never the echo that should have followed in a steel-floored building. He speculated that the mezzanine's partial collapse during construction years earlier created a space that resonated oddly, bending sound in ways the old analog recorders couldn't track. Maybe, he said in the closing narration, what Dennis heard wasn't someone walking, but the building replaying itself. The official record lists Dennis Halbrook as missing, presumed deceased. No remains were ever found. The West Wing mezzanine was melted down with the rest of the metal. Today, the old depot grounds are a parking lot for long-haul trucks. Drivers who park overnight sometimes mention hearing boots pacing above the asphalt when the wind picks up, though there's nothing there, just open sky. Local radio traffic still gets random interference near mile marker 32, short bursts that resemble a steady rhythm of footsteps. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. Two guards, years apart, logged the same minute, heard the same sound, and left no image behind. The rest, whatever it was, stayed between the missing frames of a camera that never recorded and a notebook line that never should have been there. The snowplow incident on Dalton Highway. In early winter of 2019, a road crew based near Coldfoot reported a missing operator after an overnight maintenance run north. Drivers said the weather thinned for an hour near Otagon Pass, then returned with sharp spindrift across the grade. The report reached a small dispatch room where radio traffic had stayed busy with chain controls and stalled rigs. The first message named a man who left mile marker notes, then failed to clear his scheduled checkpoint on the north slope. The operator was Mark Reyes, 44, a contract plow driver from Fairbanks assigned to the Slope District for the season. He ran a late shift that began after dusk with fuel topped and a spare V-belt strapped under the seat. His purpose was straightforward since the company had a fixed route that required timed passes across exposed sections. Witnesses remembered his voice on the radio sounding even, with short replies that kept to mile numbers and cold readings. Dispatch logs from that night list a start north of Coldfoot at 1900 hours, with guidance to hold before Otagon if winds rose. Archived notes in the district binder describe patch ice near the summit and reports of light snow sliding off the cut banks. A tanker convoy reportedly waited near Dietrich River since heavy gusts had pushed two tractor-trailers into the berm earlier. The shift sheet shows Dana Willis, 39, a dispatcher based in Fairbanks, who stayed on the channel while supervisors rotated. State records show Reyes had 12 winters on heavy equipment, with no citations and a completed safety course during 2011. He'd worked pipeline access roads, he'd pulled a grader for a private quarry, and he'd logged clear plow counts on previous runs. His intent that night was to punch through 3 choke points, then meet a mechanic near Galbraith Lake for a salt spreader swap. The mechanic was Evan Tuttle, 52, a seasonal hire whose task was to transfer gear and check hydraulic temperatures before midnight. Some locals claimed a whiteout dropped into the pass fast enough to erase taillights and mute engine sound, yet truckers never agreed. One driver said strobing snow gave the illusion of hills moving sideways across the road while the wheels stayed straight. Another said the wind was loud, but gaps kept opening, and distant beacons appeared steady along the grade for several minutes. Investigators never confirmed a single window of clear weather, since recordings captured only static bursts and clipped phrases around the summit. At 2100, Reyes checked in at a pullout south of the pass, with coolant temperature stable and front blade pressure within range. He mentioned one brief shudder through the chassis that felt like a rut, then silence followed until a short click cut the frequency. Willis radioed back twice with location requests and received nothing, then pinged a nearby rig to scan the shoulder with high beams. The rig driver said he saw drifting grooves that could have been old tracks since fresh snow filled them within seconds. A tracker unit on the plow reportedly sent 3 location bursts clustered near a curve marked by a steep drop to the creek. Technicians said the pings bounced off a repeater and came through delayed, so the timing stamps failed to match the voice log. Search teams moved in after midnight from both sides, and a grader led with chains laced tight across 2 tires. Snow fell in sheets that flattened depth and made shallow cuts look like pits, which slowed the lead truck to walking speed. They reached the curve at first light and found a blade mark that ended clean beside a low drift with no metal exposed. A second pass scraped the shoulder and revealed a hard ridge with chunks of ice wedged above a narrow gouge that fell away. Rope teams moved over the edge and found short slide debris on a bench, then a broken marker flag snagged against brush. No frame parts surfaced during those hours, and the creek ran under plates of ice that shifted with a faint grinding sound. County file from 2009 includes a similar incident where a grader vanished for 2 days before surfacing downstream near a bend. That case resolved when thaw lowered the berm and exposed a mirror that caught sun from a brief break in cloud. The comparison circulated among crew members who kept working the shoulder, yet the terrain here was different with steeper runoff cuts. Records conflict on how quickly the water can rise under drifted ice after strong wind, and the team deferred to the field lead. By late morning, a fuel tender from Dead Horse reached the site and set up heaters near a staging point above the drop. Tuttle arrived from the north with tools and asked for the last radio phrase, then checked the hydraulic lines of a parked plow. He noted a tendency for the quick couplers to chatter during crosswind, which could sound like harsh rattle over the cab floor. Mechanics later wrote that cab noise might mask a failing sensor, since cold snap could trigger alarms that barely breached the static. Aerial support from a contractor circled the pass after wind eased, and the observer described a faint brown scar cutting the slope. The scar blended with ripples left by earlier slides, and a few dark smudges along the line looked like willows pressed flat. Photographs show no bright paint or reflective decal, though one frame catches a straight groove pointing toward a tight creek bend. Investigators never confirmed those features as relevant, since snow squalls smeared edges between frames and made distances hard to judge. Afternoon brought a partial clearing that revealed a fan of ice shards downstream, and a thin sheen of coolant floated in a pool. Samples were jarred for testing, and the chain crew shifted downhill with bars to pry plates loose where the creek narrowed. A snapped radio whip surfaced near a root ball and looked fresh, but the base had no distinct paint and the mount was missing. Some locals claimed scavengers grabbed parts fast after wind events, although crews said nothing moves under that much drifted ice. Willis compiled a timeline that night using dispatch logs and audio clips, then flagged minutes where Reyes last sounded clear and calm. She included notes on tanker releases and 2 reports about a stopped reefer whose engine coughs overlapped the plow check-in. The final packet lists contacts with the State Patrol and a maintenance foreman who drove south to relieve the tired search crew. That foreman added tire print photos that seem to double along the shoulder, which can occur when chains stamp over their own path. During the second day, a Parkerized tow hook appeared in a melt pocket with scratches no wider than a thumbnail along the curve. The hook matched a model used on the plow fleet, yet maintenance inventory showed 6 variations that had circulated for years. Without a serial, technicians wrote a reserved note that placed the hook in a probable category rather than as verified evidence. Some locals claimed the hook drifted from higher on the slope, while others said the creek likely dragged it after a brief surge. On the third day, crews uncovered a ladder rack buried in compact snow beside a narrow stand of willows near the creek. The rack fit, the plow make, and bolt patterns lined up within tolerances, which moved the case toward a likely location. A downstream net caught a small panel stamped with 2 digits that matched the fleet series, though corrosion blurred the final number. Investigators never confirmed whether the panel came from Reyes's machine, and state records marked the find as inconclusive with an asterisk. A trucker who runs that road each week provided a sworn statement that places a bright headlight west of the proper lane. He said the beam cut across a hump of snow and flashed once, then vanished as wind shifted, which he logged against his odometer. Another driver produced a dash recording where only hiss and faint pops can be heard during that minute near the summit pullout. Records conflict on whether either account fits the minute Reyes went quiet, since clock drift and reception gaps complicate the match. A fourth-day probe found the plow nose buried in a kink where the creek dives under a bank and resurfaces in a small pool. Divers worked under ice with lines and spotted a cab corner wedged against a boulder, then a shattered mirror floating free. The recovery took hours as the weather dropped again, and the team cut a trench to guide the frame toward a winch. When the cab cleared, the seatbelt latch showed marks from impact, and the ignition key sat half-turned with the radio switch on. The medical report is brief and cites blunt force trauma with a probable sequence that begins with a sudden drop along the hidden bank. It notes no sign of alcohol and a normal panel, plus bruising that aligns with a violent jolt as the frame struck rock. Investigators never confirmed whether the initial slide began from crosswind push or a shelf collapse that undercut the drift from below. The final line lists cause as accident during storm response, with contributing factors that include limited visibility and shifting ice. In the months after, crews added poles near the curve and new markers above the creek, and radio checks increased before the summit. The company revised night runs and paired plows for that section, while dispatch set tighter windows for convoys during early gust fronts. Some locals claimed the changes came too late and that old warnings about the creek shelf sat ignored in a forgotten drawer. Archived notes show earlier mentions of undercut edges that never reached policy, though supervisors say budget cycles delayed permanent fixes. The Dalton Highway kept running through that winter and the next, and the pass remained a place where visibility turns to noise. State records preserve the photographs and the hook, and the rack sits tagged in a bin that lists the mile number. Drivers still slow near the curve and watch the creek where drifted plates hold for a week, then crack without warning. The file closes with a sentence that keeps to the facts and a road sign that leans slightly north when the wind rises. The stories. Why the paramedic returned to that turnout. In early March of 2017, a state trooper found a decommissioned ambulance parked just off a mountain turnout east of Ridge County. The vehicle was empty, its back doors wide open, with one boot and a stethoscope left on the asphalt. It was later confirmed the items belonged to a paramedic named Mark Renner, who had driven that same route almost exactly 1 year earlier. What drew him back to the same turnout? became the center of one of the strangest internal reviews in the county's emergency services history. Mark was 39, a quiet man who'd spent nearly 2 decades in the field. He'd seen wrecks, fires, and overdoses, the kind of scenes that hollowed out most people within a few years, but he stayed steady. Colleagues said he was professional, unshakable. The only story that ever seemed to trouble him was an accident from late February of 2016, a head-on collision on Route 92 involving a young couple and their infant daughter. The child had survived for 23 minutes in his care before the helicopter arrived, but the parents hadn't made it. Mark never forgot her crying. That sound stayed with him long after the shift ended. According to dispatch logs, Mark stopped requesting overnight shifts after that incident. He rotated into training duties for a few months, then back to field work once he was cleared by department counseling. Nothing seemed off until that following March, when he quietly signed up for the same overnight route, the same mountain stretch, and never came home. Investigators later reconstructed his movements from station cameras and gas receipts. He'd clocked in at 7:04 p.m., stopped for coffee at a roadside diner around 8:30, and drove north up the highway before pulling into the turnout just after 9:10. The dash cam on his unit, recovered from the ambulance, recorded 19 minutes of footage before cutting out. It showed a still landscape, empty road, light snow, and Mark stepping out of the cab, walking toward the guardrail, then disappearing into the dark. There was no struggle, no second figure, no sound beyond the wind. The first assumption was suicide. But the ground search found no trace. No footprints beyond a few feet from the guardrail, no sign of a fall down the ravine. The terrain was steep but not lethal, and cadaver dogs found nothing. When heavy rains swept through 2 days later, investigators halted the search. The county logged it as a presumed drowning, though the river below was shallow and slow-moving that time of year. Nearly 6 months passed before anything new surfaced. In August, a hiker found a sealed envelope wedged beneath a loose plank at a forest overlook, about 3 miles from the turnout. Inside was a folded piece of paper in a waterproof bag, written in uneven block letters. "I came back because I heard her." The note was signed M.R. and dated the same night Mark vanished. At first, analysts dismissed it as a hoax, maybe something left by someone who'd followed the case in the news. But when the lab examined the paper, they confirmed partial fingerprints matching Mark's employment file. The note's ink also matched a brand of pen issued in ambulance restock kits that year. For a while, speculation spread quietly through the department. Some said Mark had been unstable, still haunted by the loss of the infant. Others insisted he'd been fine. Then an old colleague, a retired dispatcher named Ruth Canning, came forward with something she'd kept an archived radio call from the night of his disappearance. She hadn't turned it in earlier because she thought it was just static bleed from another channel, but she'd kept the recording out of habit. When the file was cleaned and enhanced, it revealed something strange. A faint secondary voice overlaying Mark's transmission. He'd called in a routine report. "Unit 307, clear, returning to station." But beneath his words was another voice, faint and distorted, repeating a single phrase, "Still here." Audio experts couldn't fully isolate the sound. It could have been cross-channel interference, a bleed from another frequency, or an artifact from faulty wiring. Still, that clip reignited interest in the case. When investigators compared the timestamps, they realized the radio call had been made exactly 1 minute before the dashcam cut out. Following the renewed attention, a new team reviewed Mark's digital trail. On his department-issued tablet, recovered from the front seat, the last accessed file wasn't a dispatch log. It was a photo stored in a personal folder labeled Training Refs. The image, according to metadata, had been taken 1 year earlier on the night of the crash. It showed the infant's car seat illuminated by the ambulance's interior light with a small knitted blanket tucked inside. Nothing seemed unusual until they enhanced the reflection on the rear window. A faint outline of Mark turned toward the seat, mouth open as if speaking. The lead investigator, Lieutenant Harris, later told a local paper that what struck him most wasn't the evidence, but the timing. Every major event in Mark's final weeks corresponded with the accident's anniversary, the same dates, the same hours, even the same shift requests. It was as if he'd been tracing the exact pattern of that night. The county eventually filed its final report as undetermined circumstances. The official narrative suggested exhaustion, stress, and possible exposure contributing to disorientation and accidental injury. Yet, off the record, several responders admitted unease. One firefighter recalled hearing a distant sound of crying during the initial search, echoing faintly through the ravine, though no infant was ever found. In 2018, the turnout was repaved and renamed, and most people moved on. But every year, around late February, local radio operators report short bursts of static on the old EMS frequency. They last only seconds and usually coincide with wind gusts off the ridge. Nothing verifiable ever transmits through. Today, a small marker stands at that turnout, a simple white post with no inscription. Truckers still pull over there to check their brakes before the steep descent. Some say if you stop long enough, the silence feels heavier than it should, as if the air itself remembers something unresolved. No one ever proved what happened to Mark Renner. Theories range from a fall to voluntary disappearance, even to mistaken identity. What remains certain is that he returned there by choice. The note, the radio call, the anniversary, all pointed toward a man circling back to a moment he couldn't let go of. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. A paramedic haunted by one unfinished call, a turnout carved into the mountainside, and an unanswered question that time refused to bury. The rest is silence, the kind that fills the air between sirens, waiting for someone to break it again. The stories. These archived tapes were a warning at the lake. The county kept a box of old tapes that nobody requested, though people mentioned a lake in half the labels. Each reel carried a handwritten date in faded ink, spanning from 1984 through 2001, then stopping abruptly. Rena Valdez was 34, a county records technician who covered the public window and handled the backroom shelves. She had planned a quick shift, then a quiet drive to her sister's apartment for leftover stew and television. The box of tapes ruined that plan because the new intern stacked it crookedly, and the lid slid open suddenly. One cardboard sleeve read Lake Patrol. Another said Ranger Tower 2. The thickest sleeve said Dispatch Saturdays. A note at the bottom said duplicates for training, reportedly returned after audit, do not discard. The dates matched a period locals still referenced with nervous jokes, which meant details might still identify private people. She logged the box in a generic way, using the Lakeshore District and a wide date range to protect identities. She told herself it would wait until Monday, then she found herself winding a reel on the library machine. The machine clicked softly, and a voice filled the tiny playback room, thin and metallic. The first tape was a ranger briefing about posted signs and seasonal closures, and nothing seemed strange at first hearing. A man listed wind patterns, then a woman read names for volunteer cleanups, and then someone said maintenance reported missing bolts on the north dock. The voice added that the bolts were not stripped, they were removed carefully without damaging the boards. A second tape included a dispatcher answering calls about diesel sheen near the old boat ramp. According to the label, fishermen reported a smell like hot plastic, and a teenager reported chain rattling under the planks after dark. The dispatcher kept people calm while advising them to stick to lit areas and avoid the roped section. Rena paused the machine and wrote notes in her spiral, keeping each line factual with times and initials. She checked the storage log for incident reports from those dates, and the log showed vague entries about routine patrol and no injuries. It seemed like a cluster of small maintenance problems, which did not explain the careful script on the warning sleeves. She switched reels, and a new voice took over, quieter and closer to the microphone. The label said Saturdays 2, with a date from 1991 in shaky handwriting and a stamped number. The voice mentioned archived calls about chain noises again, and added that footprints led down the roped section in soft silt. Someone in the room asked about weather, and the answer was light wind, clear night, no boats scheduled after sunset. The voice then read a memo that asked rangers to log all interactions with a particular vendor near the snack stand. It said, do not escalate, document demeanor, and confirm hours against posted permits, using a separate clipboard. Rena recognized the clipboard instruction style, which matched old county risk templates for potential liability tracking. Vendors generated paperwork when things went sideways, especially near open water with kids, which made steady documentation crucial later. Still, the tapes kept circling the same triangle of dock bolts, chain noises, and the roped section. She printed a map from the binder with blank labels, then drew a tidy triangle between the dock, the snack stand, and the ranger tower. The map helped her visualize lines of sight, and she started marking places with little asterisks for maintenance incidents. The roped section sat slightly east, hidden from the snack stand by cottonwoods, which mattered for visibility. Another reel played a clipped exchange where a ranger told dispatch that a gate lock appeared new and unregistered. The ranger added that cones were moved and a laminated warning sign had clean nail holes without rust. The dispatcher asked for photos, and the answer was already taken and copied for the folder labeled permits. The next tape changed tone with a shaky breath before an officer started reading notes into the recorder deliberately. He said witnesses reported a loud splash near midnight, then a truck engine idling on the far turnout. He said tracks showed heavy tread, then lighter footsteps heading back alone, and a partial plate was recorded without certainty. Rena stopped and checked the case index, trying to locate an incident number referencing a midnight splash during that month. The index only showed a maintenance order for replacing stolen chain and a request for more reflective tape. She underlined the lack of a matching incident and added a small arrow to her running list for later verification. On Tuesday morning, she asked her supervisor if she could inventory the box more thoroughly since the reels were fragile. He nodded without interest, telling her to log whatever needed logging and to shove the box behind tax rolls. That gave her private time in the playback room, which she used to build a timeline on fresh paper. She listened to another Saturday tape where a woman from the tower called dispatch about a boat drifting across the boundary. The boat moved lazily, but the line drifted toward the roped section, which was posted as no entry. The woman sounded firm, and she logged the time. Then she asked for a ranger with a bullhorn. A tiny clink echoed on the tape before a second voice said, "Hold on," then added that a chain was loosened again. The tower watched two shapes bending by the boundary floats, and the dispatcher repeated the request for immediate response. Sirens filtered faintly through the recorder, then the tape ended with an abrupt click that did not feel accidental. Rena checked the log again and found only a note about routine lake closure with citation for boundary violation. She highlighted the citation number and scribbled a request to pull the paper copy from the offsite cabinet. If the citation sheet had officer notes, she might find names replaced with initials and a vendor detail. In the afternoon, the intern returned with coffee, and Rena asked if he knew the lake from hiking around. He said his cousins called it the turnaround, because teens use the far turnout to swap drivers late at night. He said people heard the chain in the wind and joked that it meant a shift change for the lake. She asked about the vendor by the snack stand, and he shrugged, saying an older guy sold bait from a cooler. He added that the man kept to himself, and that the stand closed after 2003 when bathrooms needed repair. Rena thanked him, then went back to the machine, because one more reel had Ranger Tower 2 in heavy ink. The reel opened with playful teasing about coffee. Then a woman said the boundary floats were drifting again toward the shallow shelf. She made a note that the vendor stayed late, counting cash, and that 3 pickup trucks idled by the turnout. She said wind from the ridge pushed small waves against the dock posts, and the sound carried. Then came a gentle thud, and the woman said quietly that bolt heads were missing again on the north ladder. She asked anyone nearby to bring a camera and mentioned small shavings near the posts, like metal caught and ground shiny. She said it looked new, not weathered, and suggested logging it as tampering after checking permits. Rena wrote ladder bolt heads missing and circled the phrase carefully, then drew a line to the earlier chain note. She felt the outline of something organized, not merely bad luck, and the tapes added a pattern of late Saturdays. She felt a pinch of frustration because the official paper trail looked deliberately harmless compared to the recordings. She filed a request to review tower logs that year, and the clerk gave her a battered binder with loose pages. The tower logs used pencil, and the Saturday pages looked smudged, but several entries repeated a vendor name pattern. The pattern matched the earlier instruction to log demeanor and hours, which meant quiet escalation without confrontation. An evening tape from 2001 began with static. Then the dispatcher said the tower line would record summaries every hour. The tower voice read weather, then listed vehicles, then paused at a truck with a partially obscured plate covered by dust. The tower added that the truck bed held a heavy chain coiled flat and the ends taped tight. Rena felt the air in the room go thin, though she knew she was just listening to old caution collected for audits. The tower voice kept going, steady and calm, calling out 2 sets of footsteps and 1 pair returning alone toward the turnout. Then the tower said the vendor appeared nervous, closing early and locking a cooler with a new padlock. Another reel documented a ranger walking the roped section at dawn, taking photos of raw scrapes on chain links. The ranger said the scrapes were bright, not dull, and the boundary floats had new gouges near the welded rings. He guessed someone had dragged the chain to the shelf, making deep channels beside the ladder posts. She studied the map again, measuring distances with the edge of a note card and aligning the triangle to the shoreline. The shelf sat where the cold current ran channel to channel, sucking down loose gear and stunned fish every spring. If someone knew that flow, they could use it to hide things quickly, maybe even move something heavy without splashing. The county maintained a box of anonymous tips from that period, and Rena requested the file through the clerk quietly. The tips mentioned fights in the turnout, and a truck with fresh dents, and late-night cash counting by the stand. One tip described a crying woman near the chain in 1991, then wrote, "He told her to get in now." Rena breathed slowly and kept her notes clinical, because she was not a detective and the tapes were not a case file. She wrote potential domestic dispute near boundary, then wrote check for missing persons in overlapping county dates. She cross-referenced the years against a public list of unresolved reports, without printing names or addresses. Within that public list, several families had posted memorial pages that mentioned the lake vaguely without pinning a location. The dates brushed the Saturday span, and at least one message thanked volunteers who had searched old drainage channels. Rena did not draw conclusions, but she felt the box had been kept near the window for a reason. The thickest reel contained a training segment that sounded like a quiet warning wrapped as procedure. A supervisor read instructions for dock inspections, then emphasized that bolts should be numbered and painted once installed. He said repeated substitutions by outside contractors had caused confusion, then urged rangers to photograph every ladder each week. He read slowly, reminding staff to check chain markings and to log any bright scrapes within 24 hours. He asked that vendor interactions stay cordial but detailed, and that cash counts should match posted hour sheets precisely. He repeated that night closures had reasons, and that the roped section protected a shelf known for unpredictable suction. The tape ended with a short statement that felt heavier than a standard sign-off, even to someone outside enforcement work. The supervisor said the lake keeps receipts, and he called tape steel a kind of ledger if you knew how to read. He then asked that all summaries be placed in the Saturday binder, followed by a written note in the permit folder. Rena returned the reels to their sleeves, then updated the entry in the inventory system with a quiet summary. She wrote that the contents included dispatch summaries, tower logs, and training instructions, and that these might interest risk management. She flagged the box for restricted copying and added a line suggesting improved storage due to evidentiary value. That night, she drove to the lake and parked by the official overlook, staying within the open hours like a normal visitor. The water looked glossy and harmless, and a steady breeze shoved new leaves across the shore in rattling waves. Families packed up coolers, while a ranger checked the rope line and reset a slack float with a practiced tug. She walked the path between the tower and the snack stand, then down to the dock where the ladder bolts gleamed. They were painted red, and small numbers were stamped into the heads, which suggested a new practice after the tapes. A sign near the rope read "No entry, shelf unstable," and the letters were bold without clutter. A man in a lake crew shirt saw her taking photos and asked if she needed anything, and she said just admiring. He nodded and said they had redone the hardware, then added that the chain had been upgraded to a heavier gauge. He pointed out a new anchor a few yards deeper where the current used to pull and said it cost plenty. She asked if the improvements followed a particular incident, and he smiled without offering details, then looked toward the tower. He said the lake gets busier every year, and they prefer keeping rules friendly and simple to help everyone. He wished her a good evening and kept walking, tapping each cleat along the dock with a small hammer. At her desk the next morning, she wrote one final paragraph for the internal memo, careful with every single word. She explained that the tapes documented a pattern of weekend tampering around a hazardous shelf with persistent chain disturbances. She wrote that witnesses described idling trucks and partial plates, and that tower logs flagged a vendor for careful tracking. She recommended digitizing the reels, then filing them with risk management as potential warnings that improved current safety practices. She attached her timeline and map using initials and generic labels to avoid identifying anyone who might still live nearby. She kept her tone neutral because the point was preservation, not drama, and the tapes already carried weight. Before sealing the memo, she added a small line that explained how the tapes worked like a quiet lighthouse. They glowed in the dark of back rooms, keeping watch over a place that looked relaxed but demanded attention. They did not accuse anyone directly, but they pointed toward the triangle where the water kept its swift accounting. She delivered the memo to her supervisor, who skimmed it, then set it aside for the weekly folder without comment. He asked if the reels were labeled securely, and she said yes, and he nodded and said, "Good, thank you." The box returned to the shelf, but the entry now carried a bright strip indicating restricted handling under department guidance. A week later, risk management requested digital transfers, citing an internal review of seasonal safety procedures for public areas. They noted that the dock hardware had improved and that the chain layout matched new engineering reports after recent surveys. They asked for any additional recordings from surrounding years to complete their context for training material. Rena stayed out of that conversation because her role stopped at preservation, though she felt a calm sense of completion. The Saturday binder had finally spoken in full sentences, and everything pointed toward the same quiet conclusion. The tapes were a warning written in small sounds that added up to a clear map of careful harm. When she finally visited her sister that weekend, the stew tasted warm, and the apartment felt crowded with plants. She described none of the lake details, only saying she liked hearing old voices explain rules that still mattered today. Her sister laughed and said she had always loved rule followers because they were the ones who kept doors from sticking. In the months that followed, the dock signs stayed bright, the chain stayed tight, and the roped section kept its distance. Families watched sunsets without wandering across the floats, while rangers checked the ladder bolts and stamped numbers. A new plaque near the overlook said thank you to volunteers for years of safe seasons without naming anyone specifically. People told stories anyway, because lakes attract stories, and most were harmless and not entirely accurate. Rena preferred the tapes because they never chased drama, and they always returned to measured facts. They cared about footprints on silt and bright scrapes on metal and the way a current can tell time. If someone asked her privately why a box of tapes mattered, she offered a simple answer without personal detail. The lake taught the staff to listen for small patterns, and the tapes taught the staff to write them down. Warnings are not always loud, and sometimes they arrive as quiet instructions that keep strangers safe. She thought of the supervisor who said the lake keeps receipts, and she believed him without needing a name or headline. The water gave back bolts and shavings and slack rope, and the staff learned to read that ledger patiently. In that way, the old Saturday voices kept working, guiding hands without demanding attention or applause. By the next summer, the tower logged more visitors and fewer citations, and the vendor stand sold cold drinks, not bait. The chain still hummed on windy nights, but people heard it as a plain boundary, not a rumor. The tapes stayed in climate storage, digitized and labeled, a warning preserved as training rather than tragedy. When the county finally archived the memo with the transfer receipts, Rena slid a copy into her personal binder. She liked the neatness of an ending that did not demand a dramatic reveal, only patient steps that matched evidence. The lake did not need a ghost, it needed attention, and those tapes had asked for it many years ago. She drove by the overlook after work one evening, watching the sun burn down into a clean line on the water. A ranger tapped the cleats again, just like before, and the chain lay tight and bright across the current. The triangle she drew on paper felt like a familiar shape in her mind, precise and ordinary, and finally understood. The ferry passenger who never disembarked at Sitka. On a cool morning in Sitka, port workers watched a ferry ease through Sitka Sound while gulls traced slow circles overhead. The vessel's horn rolled over water that smelled of kelp and diesel and early rain. Among the manifested arrivals, one name would reportedly remain unanswered at the terminal doors. People wheeled bags across wet pavement while radio traffic clicked and paused around the ramp. The absence did not ring alarms first, it only lingered as a missing footstep in a practiced routine. The passenger, listed as Charles Weaver, was 62, a retired accountant from Spokane traveling to Sitka to visit his younger sister. He had boarded at Juneau 2 nights earlier, carrying one rolling suitcase and a canvas daypack. A purser noted his quiet demeanor and a habit of reading schedules taped beside stairwells. State records list his height, his gray hair, and an emergency contact with a Washington area code. His purpose in Sitka was simple. He planned to help arrange minor repairs at a family rental. The crew roster that week included a junior deckhand named Ian, 27, who worked nights cleaning rails and checking life rings. He remembered a man matching Weaver's description standing alone near the stern during the long run south. The wind carried spray and conversation toward the cafeteria, where lights stayed warm through the small hours. Some travelers slept against windows, while others played cards near vending machines that hummed against the bulkhead. Ian said he noticed the man review a folded map, then pocket it when the aisle cleared. Dispatch logs from the terminal record the arrival time at dawn, with light rain sweeping across Baranof Island. The ramp grounded against the apron, and trucks rolled off while several pedestrians gathered under a metal awning. A clerk scanned barcodes as passengers filed past a yellow line where a guard checked random bags. The logs show a brief power flicker in the terminal hall, then a reset that lasted under 1 minute. No incident codes were assigned, and operations resumed without delay or comment. Weaver's sister reached the terminal late after a stalled school zone detour near Sawmill Creek Road. She parked near the chain-link fence and watched the last pedestrians scatter toward taxis and waiting relatives. By her account, the rain slowed and a mist sat low across Crescent Harbor. She checked her phone and called twice. Without success, the calls rang without answer, and times were stamped in her provider records. She later told officers she felt uneasy without any specific reason beyond a silence that extended past habit. When baggage carts emptied, a single gray suitcase circled on the belt with no claimant stepping forward to lift it away. The tag matched Weaver's name and routing, printed in black on a laminated slip. A terminal agent moved the suitcase behind a counter and wrote a simple note on a clipboard. No alarm was triggered because unclaimed luggage appears with predictable frequency on rainy mornings. The agent set the suitcase on a shelf and returned to help a couple searching for a misplaced fishing rod. Archived notes taken that afternoon indicate officers spoke separately with 2 travelers who remembered a man fitting the description. One was an art teacher from Sitka who sketched whales from the solarium during the night hours. She recalled the man leaning on the rail near Mount Edgecombe's faint outline when clouds parted for a moment. Another was a mechanic from Ketchikan who said the same man bought coffee twice and asked about taxi prices in town. Investigators never confirmed the timing with receipts, and no surveillance covered the solarium benches. The county file from 2009 in a separate missing traveler case shows a similar pattern of unclaimed baggage and unclear disembarkation. That earlier file included a ferry manifest, a terminal sweep, and door checks against wind gusts that sometimes move latches. It also noted how passengers occasionally exit through service doors when following crew in reflective jackets. In that instance, the traveler was located later at a motel near a cannery road after walking away in heavy rain. Investigators compared the patterns, yet the Sitka details failed to line up cleanly. Ferry officers reviewed internal access logs for closed stairwells that connect vehicle decks and passenger spaces. They found no anomalies, only routine entries by maintenance staff checking bilge alarms and a cleaner replacing paper towels. A camera near the cafeteria recorded partial views of faces during meal hours but missed the corridor leading to the aft lounge. Reviewers watched the files twice and logged timestamps at 5-minute intervals to mark movement clusters. Some locals claimed an extra gap appeared near the end of the recording, yet technicians reported no dropped frames. At midweek, state records show officers walked the shoreline on both sides of the terminal looking for disturbed kelp lines. The tide had fallen quickly after the ferry's docking, leaving slick rocks and sand flecked with broken shells. They checked ladders, pilings, and fenders for fibers or scuffs that might indicate contact with clothing or bags. A harbor patrol boat swept the inner channel while rain stiffened from the south and visibility narrowed along the hills. Nothing turned up beyond a hat band caught on a cleat that belonged to someone else. Weaver's phone connected briefly to a tower outside town at a time that conflicted with the expected walk-off window. Analysts plotted pings against ferry timetables and decided the reading could reflect device drift under poor weather. A later attempt to triangulate from neighboring towers gave no additional certainty for the immediate period following docking. The device never registered a data session in Sitka proper, and voicemail remained unchanged for several days. The phone was eventually found powered down inside the gray suitcase held behind the terminal counter. When officers opened the suitcase with the sisters' consent, they found clothing folded tightly and a small bottle of vitamins. There was also a spiral notebook with mileage notes and simple arithmetic tracking gas costs for earlier segments of travel. A handwritten list named tasks in Sitka, including a visit to a plumbing supplier and a stop at a family storage unit. Nothing suggested immediate plans beyond errands that fit a short visit. The day pack remained missing, and no one recalled seeing it after the ship's cafeteria closed for the night. A taxi dispatcher reportedly checked logs and found no record of a pickup under Weaver's name during the docking hour. Drivers sometimes accept cash riders who wave at the curb, which complicates documentation on wet mornings when lines are short. One driver remembered a man stepping toward the curb, then turning away while fastening his jacket. The driver could not establish the face, and weather limited the view through the windshield that kept fogging despite the fan. The report noted the uncertainty without assigning weight, and the lead stayed open. Some locals claimed the man left the ship early through a service door when the deckhands repositioned chocks around wheel wells. Crew statements conflicted on door status because procedures allow short openings during shifts and quick closures afterward. A safety officer said those doors close against air pressure that resists casual pushes from the outside. He added that wind can trick hinges and create sounds that resemble latches when traffic moves on the ramp. Investigators never confirmed external access during that window, and the theory remained a line in the file. Searchers walked the footpath toward Totem Park, checking benches and thickets where travelers sometimes paused to adjust bags. Rain lifted briefly, and a weak sun set bands of silver across Sitka Sound, while ravens scolded from cedar branches. A groundskeeper reported no new camps or discarded bottles that would suggest a hasty stop. Officers spoke with staff at a nearby cafe who said the morning trade moved quickly with fishermen and hospital employees. No one recalled a man drip-drying near the heater or holding a map with ferry schedules. The sister called relatives in Washington and asked about any change of plans that might redirect the visit. None were reported, and bank activity remained consistent with a careful traveler who used small cash purchases along the route. A credit card charge at Juneau showed a ferry cafeteria meal during a schedule break between legs. There were no Sitka charges and no attempts at withdrawals from machines that dripped onto the pavement near the lot. The pattern suggested momentum toward Sitka, then a full stop without financial movement afterward. Investigators checked hospitals and clinics for admissions, matching Weaver's age and description during the week after arrival. No patient aligned with his file, and air ambulance logs listed unrelated cases tied to remote villages and fishing accidents. The harbormaster distributed a brief notice to smaller docks asking attendants to report unattended bags. A trooper walked through a gear shop and asked about any customer who seemed lost or wet beyond the usual rain. Staff could not connect the details to a specific person, and the inquiry ended without a lead. A month later, A hiker on a trail above the Indian River claimed to see a jacket sleeve tangled near a root. Officers climbed the slope and found a torn piece of nylon that had weathered through 2 storm cycles. Fabric comparators could not match the weave to Weaver's clothing because the suitcase sample lacked similar material. The location strained the timeline given the docking hour and the limited paths out of the terminal. The note entered the file under unverified observation and did not change the working summary. When analysts wrote their concluding memo, they listed elements that aligned with a simple failure to disembark through the usual doors. They paired those with elements that resisted such a reading, including the phone found later with no tower contact in Sitka. They added a paragraph on ferry architecture and how movement patterns complicate any reconstruction when cameras leave gaps between spaces. A final section summarized the sister's persistent calls and her quiet visits to the shoreline in the weeks following. The memo ended with language indicating records conflict and that the absence remains without a confirmed path. Years later, the terminal agent remembered the morning every time an unclaimed bag circled the belt after a rainy docking. The memory did not carry definitive images, only small impressions tied to radio clicks and the short flicker in the hall. State records continued to list Weaver as missing, with a note that he was last associated with a scheduled ferry arrival. The file stayed active in annual audits and drew brief attention whenever travelers asked about old cases related to the route. Nothing further emerged, and the routine at the dock moved on with gulls and diesel and rain.